The most underrated variable in this election was how the two parties forced Americans to choose between being ruled by the hyper-masculine or the hyper-feminine. What was being presented both in policy, like let all the immigrants in, like defend trans rights. There was a toxic empathy behind the policy decisions on the left. In the Trump universe, it is hyper-masculinity. These two patterns are at war in our political system.
Hi, welcome to Jeremy Pryor's podcast, or what I like to call Jeremy Pryor Unfiltered. I'm his daughter and producer, Kelsey Gall, and we are excited to bring you seasons of content all the way from Tolkien to theology, from business to family. If you like to contemplate deep philosophical ideas across a wide range of topics, you've come to the right place. Make sure you give us a follow so you don't miss out on future episodes.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm here with Sydney. I think I was hesitating to say too much before the election because I'm not very partisan. I'm much more fascinated by dynamics that aren't necessarily related to like who's going to become president or whatever. Like there's a lot of other dynamics that I like to explore. But if you say anything before the election, it's always going to be seen from the lens of, oh, you're being a partisan and you're trying to get people to vote one way or another. And that's fine. Like you can say things like that, but there are some things I want to talk about that I don't want to be interpreted from that lens. And so, so I started to dive into, to me, what felt like one of the most underrated elements of this election. I saw some people talking about it. The first person that I heard really frame this was Naval Ravikant. We just did a podcast. I did a reaction video to him on the Family Teams podcast, but he tweeted back in July, it's the battle of the masculine men and the feminine women versus the masculine women and the feminine men. And I was just like, man, yes, there's a strange amount of truth in that sentiment. And I one of the things that as I was kind of thinking through this, and I'll kind of walk through my, some of the things I was trying to process with regards to the gender divide that erupted during this election. But to me, that's probably one of the most fascinating things about it. One of the things I try to observe was for 200 years, politicians thought the largest binary in the world was between the rich and the poor. But given enough time, any two-party system will begin to organize around a stronger binary, male and female. And what's interesting, Naval's way of describing this divide was kind of the more traditional masculine men, feminine women versus the feminine, the masculine women and the feminine men. So I do think there's, a lot to be said for that as well. So I'm just curious, before I dive into some of the other ways to maybe process the gender divide on this, what do you think about his framing?
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point of like it used to be a lot more of a big deal, the class divide. And I think that people kind of mix it up due to racism. Or like people don't want to hire black people. Black people are in a horrible place because of white people. But oftentimes it's a lot more of a class problem than a race problem. So I think that is really interesting that now we kind of come to the point where we view everything in like gender and race and things like that, when I think it would be a lot more accurate to view everything a little bit more of in a class way, because that is how we're living our lives. And that is kind of what I was seeing a lot with this election, was people were saying that the left and the Democrats weren't really looking out for the middle class anymore. And Trump was actually pushing what everyday people would want to see change in. And I think that was really interesting to see. Like, let's frame it a little more like in an accurate light. This is what the majority of Americans are going through right now. We can't afford groceries, we can't afford gas, things like that. Let's focus on that because we make up the majority of the population, instead of focusing on certain like marginalized races or things like that don't apply as much. So yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. A two-party system is very, very unusual. It has its own like specific dynamics, which is we always are going to see, so in a game theoretic situation, which is where you create the boundaries of a game, and then there's a certain theory of the way that that game is inevitably going to play out. And one of the things that will happen in every two-party system is that the game theoretic outcome is going to be it's going to always want to figure out where is there a 50-50 split in the population. That's going to be a natural outcome, a game theoretic outcome of a two-party system. Because if your party starts to represent a group and it ends up that that group only represents 40%, then you will endlessly be out of power for decades. And until you can figure out how to get to 51%, you're never going to be back in power. And so there is a enormous amount of pressure on that party to reformulate their platform to get to at least 51%. And they don't want, and if they get to 60%, then of course the other party is going to come and say, well, we will represent better, 10% of the people you're representing in order to pull them into so we can get to 51%. And so this is sort of the game theoretic inevitability of a two-party system. And so what Trump did that was, like you're saying, that was really unique was that, traditionally the left really represented the kind of the working class, and the right represented much more of the ruling class, or oftentimes more of the corporate interest. That was kind of the way it was often framed. And increasingly what occurred was the left began to try to represent kind of a conglomeration of groups that they felt like were underrepresented. And then the right started to represent, families, and so you had this sort of play out. But eventually what Trump did that was really surprising was that the left kept going further left in trying to represent these marginalized groups. And as they were going that direction, they began to adopt this, really the framework of, this sort of academic elite in America, which we talked about in our last podcast, the group that essentially is trying to make sacred these historically marginalized groups. But their real constituency wasn't those groups. It was really the kind of the white academic liberal elite, and at least that was a way for the right to paint them. And so then the right starts to say, well, there's an enormous, and this is really, I think, the most brilliant move of Trump was to say, it seems like what's being left out is one of the largest groups in America, which is the working class. And that represents not just the white working class, but there's lots and lots of people that are ethnic minorities in that group as well. And I think what people are shocked by that weren't expecting Trump to win was how many people from the working class, just period, regardless of ethnic group, decided to vote for him. So yeah, that was kind of part of the way that this apparently played out. All right, so I want to dive a little bit deeper into the kind of gender implications of this, and this is the part that really fascinates me the most because it has so much implications to the way that we think about family. So this election pitched father energy against mother energy. Because the country desired change over empathy, it chose the father. But like in any family, these roles are designed to work together. So that's kind of my first statement was, it was interesting to me how much in Kamala Harris's campaign, there was this Mamala a narrative that got it got a lot of people excited without realizing how off-putting that would be to people who want more father energy in leadership. And I think the reason why that was invisible to the left was because to them, that's sexist. That to think about leaders in terms of mother and father or masculine and feminine, they see that as sexist, and therefore they could play up the Mamala narrative, and crank it to a 10 without risking a blowback from anyone but, blatant male misogynists, I guess. That's just a massive blind spot that no, there's these two kinds of energy exist, and that people get to choose what kind of energy they think the country needs to be led by. And so you had this sort of hyper masculine kind of energy coming out of the Trump campaign, and this hyper feminine energy, at least an attempt at hyper feminine energy coming out of the Harris campaign. So the second tweet I did was, the Trump family is too masculine. Trump has chosen wives who accentuate his masculine characteristics instead of committing to a woman who balances the masculine and the feminine. JD Vance and Ivanka's families represent a better balance. Part of what I want to like explore, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, Sid, is like, I think one thing that people don't really appreciate is that when you get divorced and you're a powerful, rich man, um, when you get remarried, it's not like it's an equal marriage. Like when you get married when you're really young and you and your husband or you and your wife have very little going for you, and you basically build your family together, build your little empire, your little kingdom together. There's always a sense in which there's a real balance of power that I think is appropriate in the family between the masculine and the feminine, because you both contributed and you both went through the journey together. But what happens if you're, 45 years old and a wealthy, powerful man, and you decide to divorce your wife and then get remarried, and have your now wife sign prenuptial agreements? She's really agreeing to something less than a traditional marriage. That's my hypothesis. What she's really doing is she is joining a much more hyper masculine entity than a traditional family would be when you're getting married when you're young, because the reality is she doesn't have as much power as a normal wife would have in that kind of relationship. She already knows that, well, my husband, he's rich, he's powerful, and really I'm making somewhat of an agreement to sort of give up a lot of what might be an equal share of power in the family, because I really like his wealth, or I like his status, or there's other reasons why a woman might agree to that arrangement. And it's really proven by the fact that she's willing to sign a prenuptial agreement, which says that if we get divorced, then I don't get half because I didn't earn half. Like and that is sort of a de facto way of saying that whatever you agree to, let's say you agree to 5% in a prenuptial agreement, 5% of the wealth will go to you, no more, no less, or no more than that. Well, you're basically saying, yeah, that's the amount that I'm getting in exchange for getting to be a part of, this man's, amazing masculine empire. And similarly, I think Elon represents that. Elon has built a similar hyper masculine family by breaking free from the presence of a singular feminine partner in his family. And so this what we're seeing is what feels like a really hyper masculine cabinet, hyper masculine, like the White House and the executive branch of the United States is going to have that feeling. And I don't think this is really being, properly described or understood, and all the implications of that. But yeah, curious what your thoughts are on that, Sid.
Have you ever considered starting a family business so you can spend more time working as a family team? We've started a year-long coaching program called Family Inc., where you get weekly coaching with Jeremy, access to our video training for launching family businesses, and lots of ideas for businesses to start that are working for other family teams. Head over to familyteams.com and click Family Inc. to learn more, or to set up a strategy call with Jeremy to see if this might be a good fit for you.
I mean, it does make sense that the woman that marries that rich 45-year-old, 50-year-old man wouldn't be as much of a shareholder in what he has, because she had no part in building it up. Now she's just part of what he spends it on. Now she's basically agreeing to be taken care of and to be his arm candy for however long that relationship lasts. That's kind of how I see it. I don't know. I don't presume to know what 100% of these cases are like, but that is kind of what I see. And that is kind of the, like, I want to say kind of toxic masculinity that people often refer to. Like when I think of in the past, this was kind of a normal thing for an old man to marry a really young woman. Um, and it was a little bit more natural than the other way around, because women are more attracted to power and men are more attracted to beauty. And so it makes sense that it would go that way. But oftentimes it was not to the agreement of the woman. But nowadays we're just seeing these people that are, I think of them as like whatever podcast girls, the kind of girls that would be on the whatever podcast of like, oh yeah, I just, rich men hire me to go on a date with them, and they buy me dinner and they pay me thousands of dollars, and that's my job. And they're totally okay with that. They love their job. They love what they do because they don't have to do anything except be pretty, I guess, put effort into their appearance, and then they get thousands of dollars for it and free dinner and to be seen with a rich man and all these things. And it's kind of ridiculous, but yeah, I do see how that is really playing into kind of the bad parts of masculinity, where you don't have to really build something from the ground up with anyone. You just have to get to the place that you are, and then you'll get a hot girl. And girls don't have to stick with men until they get somewhere. They don't have to be faithful. They don't have to bear children. They don't have to work with them. They don't have to be partners with them. They just have to partake in whatever it is that they have made of themselves later on in life. And that is kind of just the opposite of what God's design for marriage was.
Right. I think the best way to actually describe exactly what you're saying, there's a word for it. It's polygamy. So polygamy, there's a movement of functional polygamists in our culture, right? Andrew Tate's a perfect example of what you're describing. And there's a really strong promise that polygamy gives to a man, which is that as soon as there's more than one woman involved, right, whether that's through divorce and remarriage or through having lots of girlfriends on the side that are arm candy, basically that means that you're going to be in charge. Like your culture, your desires, that it's going to be a 95% masculine world in which you're going to live, and these women have very little power in that structure, because if they say anything, you just move on to the next woman or the other wife, and she just gets instantly marginalized. And so you only get access to the man in a polygamous structure if you please him. Whereas in a monogamous relationship, there's a genuine need for compromise, because the man, his ability to have a good life, to have a sexual relationship with his wife, it's implicated by the quality of that relationship. And so if she's like, I feel completely neglected, I think that you're being abusive, or you're, then he's got to moderate those things in a monogamous relationship. Obviously there's ways for him to possibly marry somebody that he could totally manipulate. There's ways that this doesn't happen in monogamy, but it's very difficult. And the more common, expression of monogamy is it gives a lot of power to the female and to the feminine in the family. And I think that's a good design. But these functional polygamists, it's not, they're functioning differently. And my point isn't I'm not trying to take shots at Trump or Elon or even Andrew Tate so much in this conversation as trying to just take a big step back and say, we just need to observe what's about to happen, which is that, and this is kind of the next thing I began to describe, without the symbol of an official royal family, the presidency represents the symbolic ruling family to Americans. And the most underrated variable in this election was how the two parties forced Americans to choose between being ruled by the hyper-masculine or the hyper-feminine. Now, a lot of people took issue with, hey, I don't think Kamala is hyper-feminine. I agree with that 100%. But I think that what was being presented, both in policy, like let all the immigrants in, like defend, trans rights, like there was a toxic empathy behind the policy decisions on the left. And so it wasn't necessarily to say that Kamala herself represents the perfect sort of embodiment of hyper-femininity. I don't think she does at all. But I do think that these two patterns are at war in our political system. And the way that they're really being lived out is primarily at the policy level. I would say in the Trump universe, it is hyper-masculinity. And so I think that's a better, description of that. And then I also said, beware of following this pattern in your own family. God's design is to have the family ruled by the masculine while being continually moderated and calibrated by the active feminine. So you think in a ruling situation where you have a male CEO or a male president or a male, any, male pastor, one of the things that makes that man a good leader is that he's being constantly evaluated by his wife, and she's constantly giving him feedback and helping calibrate him. One of the things that I wrote as well is it's the presence of the masculine without the moderating influence of the feminine in the Trump family that caused millions of women to have a visceral fear of Trump. I think one of the things you're seeing with people, especially women that are just like melting down, it's kind of confusing to watch. You're like, what are you so afraid of? What do you think he's going to do? And I think the emotional reaction is, well, I don't, and there used to be sort of a DEI kind of version of this, which is like women need to be equally represented in every situation as men, equally represented in the boardroom and equally represented in Congress. And until we get to a 50-50 parity, we live in a misogynist world. Now, I don't believe that at all, because I think that that totally negates what is happening in the family unit. So if you have, 90% of men in the Senate, for example, you don't just have 90% of masculine influence. The vast majority of those men are going to be married to women who are actively engaged in a relationship with those men and helping calibrate them if they are in a healthy marriage. But of course, when you have these sort of functional polygamists that are being elected, then that moderating influence doesn't exist. And I think that a lot of women sort of sense that puts them in a vulnerable situation. Not only are they not equally represented in that kind of DEI sense, but they're not even being represented within the family itself of these sort of functional polygamous family structures. So that I think is part of where the reaction is coming from.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that's such an interesting dynamic because I think God was very purposeful in the way that he designed the masculine and the feminine, and they're supposed to be very complementary. And it's just terrible when they're being pitted against each other because we need both. I don't want to choose one over the other. Maybe I wanted to choose Trump this time because we've seen too much of the toxic empathy in this country, and I wanted to choose the opposite of that. But at the perfect scenario would, of course, be the marriage of the two, to use that word
Yes.
appropriately. And I hope that there will be enough of the feminine in the Trump campaign and in his surrounding circle that will help moderate it. I think maybe what we need is masculinity, but I hope that it doesn't go too overboard. And I have seen these people that are melting down all over social media, and it is like all these women that are afraid that they will have their rights taken away. And of course that's not true, but you can understand like if they think that empathy is being taken out of office, this hyper masculinity is taking over and no one is going to have empathy for them anymore. I can see from that standpoint why they're freaking out and why they're so afraid. And I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think they're going to get their rights taken away. But if what they're seeing symbolically is that this takeover of the hyper masculine, they're afraid that they will get just thrown aside and no one will think about them anymore. And that is a scary feeling. So if they're feeling that, I understand why they're
Yeah.
freaking out.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. It is understandable that there would be fear. One of the things that Trump did that surprised me, was a pleasant surprise. I don't know enough about her to know how big of a deal this is, but he has nominated Susie Wiles as
Yeah.
his chief
Chief
of
of staff.
staff. That does seem like the kind of person that's like probably the most moderating position in the White House, in terms of like having access to the president and really standing between the president and other people, being in charge of the staff, being in charge of his schedule. I think there's just a lot of opportunity for that person to influence the president and sort of choose a woman for that position. I think that's interesting. And I hope
Yeah,
she
I'm
lasts or
interested to
that
see.
works.
Yeah, I'm interested to see because apparently she's the first woman to ever be in that position.
Oh,
So that's really, yeah, I'm interested to see how that dynamic is going to work out. Also, Tulsi Gabbard, wasn't she going to be appointed as some kind of security, um,
yes.
homeland security leader?
Right.
Or
Yeah, she's being nominated for that position as well. Yeah. And
Mhm.
she's a very strong woman. And I think that I would be excited to see what, she brings to his cabinet. Um, Yeah. And again, I don't want it to sound like a lot of DEI in attempts to bring together an equal number of every kind of ethnic and gender group into balance. I think the reason why this is important in this unique case is because of what I started with, which is that because Trump doesn't have what is a really normal partnership with his wife. And I don't know exactly what's happening behind closed doors, but I just think that when you, again, I think there's an inevitability when you're getting married later in life as a powerful man, it changes the dynamic in the home. And you see that obviously with the fact that, you know, he's had extramarital affairs and, like, it's just not a normal kind of marriage that you would want to see. Now, is this symbolically a problem? My friend Jordan Ciciotti asked me this question. I thought this was really, really well stated. He said, I completely agree with your assessment of the tendencies and energies this election brought forth. Do you think our governing authorities in the U.S. ought to be modeled in the same way God's design and hierarchy for the family should be? In other words, should a father, mother, and children dynamic exist in government as well as the home? I'm curious to know your thoughts and rationale. Great question. Yeah, the thing, I think the reason why, and I want to be careful in terms of like, um, should it be the reason why I have a lot of interest in this topic of whether or not what happens in the home is reflected in governance is actually because the Bible draws this connection with regards to governing in the church. Like if you read like First Timothy 3, it's describing how the body of Christ should be governed. And the way that Paul describes it is that this group of elders need to be placed in positions of governance. And the primary qualification of those elders is what's going on in their own homes. And one of the first things that it says about these elders is that they must be a one woman kind of man. It says basically that they need to be the husband of one wife. In other words, not a polygamist. Like that's exactly that was like the first qualification. Now, why would Paul make that the first qualification? If you actually look at the Greek there, it is sort of saying, something even a little bit more specific about this, a one woman kind of man, a man who is in a dynamic partnership with the wife of his youth. I think that's really what it's describing there is ideal. Again, we have to be a little bit careful about describing the ideal versus what might be like compromises you might make in extraordinary circumstances. But I would say in a normal world, you want people in governance who have a track record of having a very good dynamic in their marriage. And the way you know that that dynamic is good is because it's lasted since they first were married. It's their first, marriage. They haven't gone through a divorce, and they have created a beautiful, functional household, and they have children, as Paul says, that are in a relationship with him in which they like and they are willing to rank under their parents. He's basically saying, okay, these are things that demonstrate to you that there's a really good dynamic in that marriage, and therefore this man who somehow has been able to create this kind of a household, that's the kind of guy that we want to govern the church. Okay, so that's what we have in the New Testament to give us an idea of what really healthy governance looks like: a plurality of men who are in a good track record of one of these dynamic relationships with their wife, and that the fruit of that is really positive when you look at their family, their household, their children. And so I would say that is a dynamic we should want in government. Now, we're not given that dynamic in a binary choice between, two people, neither of whom fit that description. So I'm not telling anybody, of course, who to vote for. Thank God the election's over. But if you were to say, like, in a primary or in a situation where there's lots and lots of potential candidates, you're looking at 20 different candidates. Should I look at wanting someone who's got a really healthy dynamic in their marriage? Yeah, like that is something I'm going to look for. That is something I'm going to want to, and that's why, like, when I look at someone like JD Vance, I'm like, okay, I don't know much about what's going on, in private in his marriage, but the way that they come across, he and his wife, it does sound or feel a lot like there's a healthy dynamic there. And over time, as they raised kids and as they continue their marriage and stay faithful to each other, God willing, that's going to increase my confidence that, oh, maybe he's somebody who really is. Another good example is, like I said, Ivanka and Jared Kushner, like Trump's daughter. When you look at the way that, like, I want to see them stay married for decades. I want to see them raise amazing children. I want to see a lot of fruit come out of their family and their partnership. And those are things I think that are reasonable to want to see in a situation where you've got lots and lots of options for who to pick for potential people that might be in positions of governance. And yeah, that's kind of my answer to Jordan's question. But I'm curious what you think of. Is this something we should be like actually? Should we care about this when it comes to governance over the country that's not not within the church, not within the family?
Are you following us on Facebook and Instagram yet? Look up @Family Teams to get even more free content and never miss out on event announcements.
I think to some degree, yes. I think that the biggest argument that I heard the anti-Trump people using was that he was a womanizer, he cheated on his wives and like all that stuff. And I think those were valid criticisms of him. Like, I am never going to defend someone that cheats on their wife. I'm never going to defend someone that has that many marriages and things like that. It's like, obviously there's some kind of personal thing that they believe that I don't believe, and so I'm not going to agree with that. Um I'm not going to defend that. I don't think that that is good behavior. I feel like that this is a case where I mean, I would have liked it better if someone else had won the primaries, probably. I think that would be the best case scenario is if Trump wasn't even one of the presidential candidates. Um, if it was someone else that had better values, because I think that there are plenty of people that have the same values as Trump and are actually upstanding husbands and fathers. I think that one thing about Trump, though, that is kind of redeeming is how much he cares about family. And I think that it
Yes.
is so maybe that is something that is a little bit more new. I think that he has already always cared, maybe, but obviously his behavior, might say otherwise. But I think that he can't stop talking about family. Like, it is so important to him. It is like one of the most important things to him. And he's very proud of his children and his grandchildren and all that. And so I think that is kind of a redeeming quality where I think that his actions have been questionable. I think that his character, when it comes to that, is questionable. But I think that his priorities are pretty sound to where he is so much of a family man. Like, in any of his speeches, he will bring up his family in some form. So I think that's really great. But yeah, I think best case scenario, you would want someone representing your country and leading your country that doesn't have that kind of track record. But I think that his values and his priorities now and the way that he handles, foreign relations and the economy and things like that are definitely a lot of what our country needs right now. So I think that if he did have this track record and he didn't care as much as he does about family and all this stuff, he would be a lot less of an option for me. But yeah, I think that in Trump's case, I'm glad that he won and I'm glad that he's going to be president for the next 4 years. Hopefully he'll clean house. But yeah, it is definitely way preferable to have a man in office that has never, cheated on his wife or has always been faithful to one wife. And I think in that it is kind of difficult to separate the church and state in that way because I don't think that a lot of people will have those convictions, have the same convictions as us. And I think we need to be a little bit fair on that. There's a lot of Christians that are upset with how pro-choice Trump is. He's still pro-life, but he's on the pro-choice side that Christians aren't a fan of. And his like LGBTQ support and all this stuff. So there's going to be, when we separate church and state, there's going to be a lot of differences there. I feel like I really like the dynamic now of having the vice president be a very strong believer with a strong marriage and family. I feel like that is pretty cool to have like someone that high up in power have those values, but still not be like the man in charge. I think that's a pretty to know that JD Vance's voice will be constantly in Donald Trump's ear is very comforting. To have someone that high up in office be a believer and have these values and stuff. So I think I like that dynamic. I'm
Yeah.
not too concerned.
Yeah.
But
Well, your point about maybe things have changed, maybe we don't know exactly what's going on. And when you look
yeah,
at the fruit of the family itself, it's so interesting. Like, you do have, yeah, like you have these layers. Obviously in the Trump family. You have, Donald Jr. You have Eric and Laura Trump, who, man, she's a strong woman, and what she did with the RNC was pretty remarkable. And then you have, yeah, the obviously Barron. Nobody really quite knows exactly what he's doing, um, he's very, he seems like to your point, like Trump seems proud of his son, all of his sons, and his daughters, and there's also the Kai Trump. I guess she's the granddaughter, who's Eric and Laura's daughter. I think or no, I think she's maybe Don Jr.'s daughter. She's been, yeah, very vocal and engaged. And you do look at this multi-generational family that's like, okay, there's something going on there. Ryan Osinski, shout out to Ryan. He and I have been interacting a lot online at different times. He said, I would add the caveat that all this is true strictly of their public image. None of us personally know any of these people, and how it looks behind closed doors might be totally different. If you follow the Trump family members' social media accounts, there are hints of moderating feminine influence, which may explain the drastic change in demeanor between the last election and this one.
huh,
So yeah, I hear what Ryan's saying there, and that's what I think you're saying too. Like, hey, we don't really know what is going on, and there does seem to be a moderating influence going on, which could be really encouraging. Again, one of the things I love about no longer having to vote and not having the election is I hope everybody can take a look at this and say this is not primarily a campaign conversation. We're really just trying to understand how these two patterns work and how God designed this. And, the fact is we are going to be influenced. And this is why I like to call this out. I think that people might, well, why are you nitpicking? Why are you talking so deeply about this one family you don't know a ton about? Well, the reason, you guys, is that because we don't have a royal family, they symbolically have such an influence over the way that family is seen in our country and across the world. And so I think it's worthwhile for those of us who care a lot about the theology of family, the philosophy of family, which is, my pet subject. Like, I really care about this topic. I want to understand that, am I being influenced in a direction to think about family a certain way, and to think about the partnership between men and women. And each of these candidates really represented what would have been, I think, a sea change of influence on the way that families are perceived. And so the fact that we went with the more hyper masculine candidate, I think, is going to have implications that we need to be aware of, so we can moderate those influences in our own lives that maybe aren't positive, and also maybe look at some of the elements that are positive and say, okay, this is something that might be restored, or something we can maybe be happy about. But I do think overall it's unfortunate that the presidency carries this level of symbolic significance. This is one of the things I think it's so cool about having a royal family, like in the UK, for example, because it's possible to elect a prime minister in that country and for their family not to represent sort of the symbolic, that doesn't necessarily carry the symbolic weight for what
huh,
we're all aiming at as a family, that the royal family tends to in the UK. And I think the reason why British subjects and people around the world are so interested in the royal family.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think that is kind of unfortunate too. Because at the end of the day, like for me, my priorities were higher, than Trump's character. Like I, his questionable, past didn't matter as much to me as his policies and the way that he would handle ruling the government. But there is still that factor of he is like representing us, and the character of the president does matter, to some degree. And I'm glad that something has happened to make him a lot more of a family man and a lot more, like you were saying. Um, but yeah, I think that is unfortunate. I wish we did have more of a symbol as Americans to look to when it came to the family and the dynamics between feminine and masculine, besides mama love versus Nazi Trump. Like I wish there was a little bit more of an accurate symbol there, but yeah,
Yeah, and at this point, yeah, we're all going to watch the show, unwind, and we're going to see all the ins and outs. And we made our choice as a country, and now, yeah, we're gonna get to live with the good and the bad, and that's why let's keep the one thing I am probably more than almost any other. There's two things I'm excited about. I would say relieved about. One is freedom of speech. You know, if there was a Kamala a presidency, this conversation, I'd be a little bit more nervous, just to be like getting on this podcast and just saying whatever thoughts I have. I think there are other people they see Trump as a fascist and they're really nervous about saying blunt things. But the track record of actually being canceled for saying things, I really, really hope that we could be done with that. Like whatever that represented, I just, please, let's stop that. And probably the other show that I'm super excited to watch is the Department of Government Efficiency, the whatever Elon and Vivek are going to do to change the nature of the government. I think it's going to be painful. I think a lot of people, it's going to be talk about hyper masculine. You really can't be operating from primarily a lens of empathy when you're about to eliminate hundreds of thousands of bureaucratic positions in the government.
Yeah.
But man, do we ever need somebody to do that work if we're going to hand a decent government to our grandchildren without just endless debt. And so we'll see if they can pull it off. It's incredibly difficult to get into that part of the government and actually make a dent. But we'll see what they can do. But I will be enjoying the show either way. I hope so. Sid, thanks so much for jumping on here and talking with me about this topic.
Yeah, thanks for talking. This was fun.
Thank you for listening to Jeremy Pryor's podcast. Make sure you hit that follow button so you don't miss out on any future content. Follow Jeremy on Twitter and Instagram, as well as his Substack blog, all linked in the description. See you next time.